have to say when it comes to early Unitarian and Universalist theology, I am a little bit of a nerd. I've loved learning about our history. I started learning about our history when I was in high school as a Unitarian Universalist. Actually, I remember in high school writing an essay on our Unitarian history. So it's been in my household for a while and something I enjoy. So I hope to share some of the passion with you as well as some of the questions that it comes with today. I want to open just by kind of, I don't know if we have time, but basically just, I think we go around and ask people to share some words. Is that right? Just like, how are you doing this week? Is that what we do?
Well, we're going to do a little bit of a check-in with folks, which with so far only Margie and Jenny won't take that long. So we can certainly move into that. I do want to let me just share my screen quickly, and so that we can just review what it is we're doing. I don't know, can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
So the screen, the one I want to share is just what we're doing. So we're right now, welcome, glad to see you. We're going to spend a few minutes sharing. I'm going to ask you, hey, how you doing today? And are you present with us? But also, how's the reading going for you? Was there anything that, as you processed last time, was there anything that, any ideas that came up for you about how to maybe use some of this in your work? Or is there any area that you are interested in maybe doing a little bit more exploration? So informal, but just kind of a check-in to see how you are. We're going to delve a little bit into early Unitarianism, and we had some readings around that. We'll take our break, and we'll then move into early Universalism and spend a little bit of time, finish up with some time looking at some of the early voices around religious instruction. And then we'll take some time to close together. Any questions about where we're going today? All right, well, that's the end of the screen share for me. I'm also, as we move into the content pieces, I'm going to suggest that we all stay together in one conversation group rather than using our breakouts, because it is such a small group. It doesn't seem necessary. That takes care of the logistics for the day. So who would like to start us off with just a little bit of a check-in and how the reading is going for you and questions that might be popping up? Margie or Jenny?
As I mentioned before, Pat, this is Margie. I really haven't got to the readings too much. I've skimmed them over. I've found all of them, but I haven't been able to get into them too much, nor so, including when we did the last webinar. I did it from vacation.
Right, that's right. I remember that.
So,
yeah, so you're home now.
Yes.
And hopefully you'll have some time to do a little bit of catching up.
Yes.
Good. Great. Jenny.
So I had done the reading before the first meeting we had, and I had planned to review it here prior to the day of. And in that time, I've just taken on the role of training under our admin, who is leaving at the end of the month to fill in until they find somebody to take the role. And then I was like, oh, okay, well, I got a couple hours before the meeting, and then someone's like, hey, are you going to be around? Because we needed to talk about a service that's going to happen basically the week after I get back from RE by the Sea. So, hey, hi. I did do the reading, but I haven't reviewed it recently to really talk too much about it. And I'm really sorry about that.
That's okay.
I'm just trying to keep
Emily
up with
and I have done the reading, so
You have a minister coming August 1st too. So, you know, all kinds of changes going on over here.
I know you have a new minister. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Oh, Anne Marie Alderman. Oh,
Yeah.
wonderful, wonderful. She's lovely.
So yeah, I met again with her via Zoom last week, or at the end Monday last week. So Wednesday last week. So yeah, it's just been kind of a little chaotic over here. I haven't gone away yet. I'm aiming to do that tomorrow night, which will be great because it'll be the third Sunday I've had off since March.
Oh,
and we're trying to work that out also, but with all of the changes, it's just not really been possible. And I am only half time in the coordinator position, so it's
right.
Wow.
growing pains and awkwardness all around.
Yeah.
Also, I want to just recognize, sometimes I feel like the pressure of being there on Sunday falls to religious educators more than it does to ministers. And I say this being married to a youth pastor, an ordained youth pastor, who has been there every Sunday since February.
Wow.
And it's driving us crazy. Like, we will get a break soon, but I just want to recognize the realness of all the dedicated work that happens on Sunday mornings for educators, and a deep appreciation, while also hoping that you get a break soon.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm hoping. My family's from Cape May, and my sister's up from North Carolina visiting my aunt and uncle, who are like my parents. And, you know, my kids, one of my kids is down there, and one of them is up here in the next room with me right now. And we plan to go down this weekend.
Wow.
So that'll be a little break. It'll be nice.
That's great.
As far as, just as a reminder for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to be talking about Unitarian and Universalism. So, of course, the documents that we've given you as resources, they're going to be important resources for you for educational purposes, for your RE classes, for other foundational things. But as far as the discussion today, we're going to be going a little bit more abstractly than like what was on page 6, you know.
Definitely.
Yeah, I gathered that from last time. So
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I'll do a brief check-in as well. Today is in just a matter of hours, I will be starting my vacation. So I'm excited about that. It's nice. I've got a week off coming up. I will be actually in Wildwood Crest. I'll be able to throw a stone across the jetty to you down there in Cape May.
Cool.
My younger son, who lives in California, who has not missed a trip to Wildwood Crest in his 28, almost 29 years, is flying in tomorrow morning from San Francisco. So I'll be picking him up. So I'm excited about that. That's my life, taking some time off. And all of the preparations for RE week are starting to get real. So that will be when I return on August 1st. That will be what I have on my plate. So it'll be fun. So that's my check-in.
So as far as my check-in, I haven't yet gone on an official vacation. I'm still planning, because my wife has Vacation Bible School for 2 straight weeks. So we are trying to find time after Vacation Bible School. It's actually going to be after RE week to do vacation. We're still trying to figure out what that looks like. But we're planning towards that marathon in August. So yeah, I've been working, but the summer is just, it's an interesting place as a minister. I will admit I'm a little down on myself this summer because I just have not had focus. My meetings have been canceled because people have had a hard time meeting. I've been trying to do a lot of pre-work, and it's just and now I'm just like, it's the end of July, beginning of August. Oh no, I have so much to do. So I've been in a little bit of a almost panicked overdrive this week of trying to make sure that I have everything in place to do some pre-work before the church year kicks in. But I know everything's going to be fine. It's been an interesting summer so far for really great reasons. Otherwise, life is going really great.
All right. Well, we're going to move through this session pretty fast, given the small group. So that'll give us extra time to dig in to the conversation, or we'll finish early and we will all move on to all of the good and exciting things we have before us. So Emily, are you ready to start us off on exciting journey through American or through early Unitarianism?
Absolutely. So I guess before I go into the questions that are specifically asked in this session, I just wanted to ask you all, with whatever you have read, what are things that stood out to you? And then I'll move on to another question before we dive into the questions that were asked of us. So what were some things that you thought of or things that really stood out to you about learning about early Unitarian history?
So I said we've always been in the minority. We have always been the quiet voice, or not so quiet voice, but we've gone up against the dominant voice, it seems like to me, historically.
As a note to what Patricia just said, I think even the name Unitarian for me is funny because it was there in our reading a little bit, but Unitarian actually was a slur that was used against congregational leaders as, oh, you can't trust them. You can't trust them as Christians. They're Unitarians.
Right.
They're not Trinitarian. It actually was.
Don't we get that now sometimes?
Huh?
Don't we get that now sometimes, though, to an extent?
I mean, yes, absolutely. I have a personal experience with that myself because when I was in high school, long story, for some reason, trying to learn to be a minister for senior career day, I followed the Catholic priest. And when I was he actually asked me to explain my faith in front of a room of fourth grade Catholic boys, which was the most terrifying moment of my young adult life. And even there, they're like, so you don't believe in the Trinity? Like, yeah, there are still people today who give us that kind of dirty look about being Unitarians. But what I think is funny, like many parts of history of many quote unquote minorities, we accepted, we ended up celebrating the word. It ended up becoming our name. And as a short way of saying, yes, we do believe in the oneness of God, and it's not an insult.
It looks like Ashley is signing in.
Yeah, my sister, I was talking to my sister this morning, and she lives near the University of Wilmington, so the congregation down in Wilmington, and she was talking to me about how, and has 20-year-old kids, like 20 and 22-year-old, and an 18-year-old, and she was saying how one of her daughter's friends was talking about how, and they go to the university, and and like, we have, she's like, oh, and then I was at church, and my sister did like kind of this double take, and she's like, you're out on your own, you're a young adult, and you're going to church on your own. So she was talking more to her, and she's like, oh, I know what that is. My sister goes to another congregation, you know, with the same denomination. And so it was interesting to have my sister give me her feedback on what she thought UUism. And I know that isn't the beginnings of like Unitarianism right now, but it was just an experience I had today with, like, it was just how she perceived it, and it's how we were just talking about, sometimes it was a slur, and now it was this positive thing because you can explore and you can, so it was just, the contrast was there.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. Want take a minute to welcome Ashley.
Hi, Ashley.
We have a small class today, so we're moving along quickly. We had a moment to just check in and, you know, how things are going for us today. And if you have any questions or concerns about the reading or any big insights that you wanted to share. So if you would like to check in with us, we would welcome that.
Well, I apologize again for being late. It wasn't because I didn't get the email. It's actually my birthday today, and I was at a family celebration.
Happy birthday!
Yeah. So I rushed in as soon as I could. But anyway, no, I'm doing well. I enjoyed the reading and was interested in the discussion today. So I'm not sure what I've missed, if you've already gone into questions or.
We've just started.
So basically, we've just been asking, you did the reading. What are some things that stood out to you, just as a first thing to cover before we get into the deeper discussion questions?
So I think what stood out for me was just I was thinking through the correlation between a unified God versus a Trinitarian God, and kind of the emphasis on social justice and what the tie between those two things. It's just an interesting dynamic that I noticed with the people that we were reading about, you know, the kind of the history of the theologians. So it was just something I was pondering, and that probably stood out the most to me.
I think we're going to get that in our discussion questions later. We'll get to that connection. Yeah. Any other observations you want to bring up now before we dive back in? Okay.
So when I was a kid, I always, because kids are maybe attracted to certain macabre things, but I always thought it was kind of cool that we had some actual martyrs in our history, that there were really truly people who died for this faith that we've inherited. And I always found some sort of morbid fascination with that, I guess. But the story of Michael Servetus is one that has always stuck with me. And I think kids kind of get interested in that one. So from an RE standpoint, that's a good story.
I agree with you. It's a really fascinating story too. And I sometimes think that sometimes what modern Unitarian Universalism doesn't always dive into is our Christian roots a little bit. We talked about this in our theological diversity section. But we've always been there. We've always been a part of Christian history, whether it was Arian beliefs that created right around the same time as the Nicene Creed was being written, whether it was the same things that happened with Christianity, where it began to become government politics in Germany with the Holy Roman Empire. We had similar things happening in Transylvania with Francis David and others, right? And also the Protestant Revolution. It's the Protestant Revolution with Martin Luther who set the stage for people like Michael Servetus to start really talking about why believing in the unity of God was important, and the difference of Christ being a prophet and not a God, being a human being and a prophet instead of a God, which was at the time and still is in some circles radical to some, right? Yeah.
I will say, I guess I do have another observation. I grew up Calvinist, and really just made the journey away. I went to a Reformed seminary, actually, and so the journey for me in kind of discovering different aspects of theology has been just in the last decade. So it's been really fascinating for me to have this reading and see the argument in from a very different perspective. So I don't know, I've really enjoyed, or I've just been really fascinated by it. And kind of the people who were the bad guys before, now I'm learning from their perspective how they were thinking and seeing things. And I think because I came from the other side, and I know I'm much more familiar with, the Protestant Reformation from the Protestant side there. I don't know, it's just really fascinating to see kind of what the enemies were were discussing and how they viewed things.
Yeah. I'll take a 2-second nerd moment. So I happen to be married to a Presbyterian minister who actually is pretty much of a Calvinist. Everyone's like, how does your relationship work? But she's, someday later, I'll let you know that she has a whole argument about how Calvinism actually argues for universalism, which is complicated. But she's a Universalist Calvinist, which is not the traditional sense of Calvinism. Let me just tell you that. But anyway, what I find funny is because I've now spent like a few years with my wife talking theologically, we talk about the relationship specifically of John Calvin and Michael Servetus, which, if it's not always spelled out, but one of the reasons why he died a martyr is because he basically went nah, 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 nah to John Calvin for like 10 years. They debated in essay form on a regular basis. And back then, it might not be seen in like, because we read 17th century language that doffeth and protesteth and various things, and we think it's so fancy. But actually, Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Michael Servetus all wrote essays that were just filled with insults, completely layered with insults around each other's intelligence, about how they were reading the Bible, how they were interpreting, and why. And so it's funny to, I never knew that history until I went to seminary. I really read through some of the things. But it's funny to think about the lens of, like, we think about the Protestant Reformation and things that happened in our theological history in these ways that really seem aloft or like some grand martyrdom, but actually they were, in part, yes, it doesn't decrease their martyrdom, but also they were human beings who did very human being stuff, including insulting each other to each other's faces. And I think it's a part of the history that we forget that can be fun to think about. Okay. Thanks for letting me nerd out for a few minutes.
Oh, it's totally like Aaron Burr and Hamilton, right? Back and forth and insulting each other until it came to a point. But I don't know what happened with, I'm not familiar with the story of Michael Servetus, so I don't know how similar that would be, actually.
It actually is pretty similar. I think so Michael Servetus was burned at the stake for heresy.
Okay.
What led up to that point, though, was beyond just what was happening with John Calvin. And so there's the personal insults, right? But what ended up happening eventually is that government officials were involved. So at the time, there was a large stake invested, both in the German state and in other states in Europe, about who had the right to claim religion, who were you allying with, and different countries had sides. Mm-hmm. And when they staked sides, and Michael Servetus was in that country, they're like, well, we believe this now. This is our religion. You're against this religion. We have to persecute you and burn you at the stake. You're saying heresy.
Yeah.
So that's part of the reason historically why that got ramped up. It was not just these three officials, but it really did. Religion, especially back then, but even we can think about it in today's terms, when government policies side on the side of one particular religion, being a heretic can become life-threatening.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I know my husband, he's not a theologian, but he studied a lot. He doesn't think John Calvin would have wanted it to go the way that it went with Servetus, even though, he was involved in it. But it was a much bigger than just Calvin. And honestly, I think Calvinism today is a lot different from the actual writings of John Calvin. I don't think he would espouse a lot of what happens today in his name.
Sorry, I'm having trouble with my tablet and microphone. If there are no other observations, I'm going to move us into discussions of early Unitarianism. So we've kind of already been there, and I'm just going to give a very overview layer of some of the tenets of Unitarianism, which were covered by our reading. It believes in, basically, I think you might have had the John Friedman quote here. I don't know if it was here or if it was in the last one. 1 second. Let me find it. Sorry, 1 moment. Yeah. So, of course, Reverend James Freeman Clarke came much later, not much later, but basically 50 years later as a Unitarian minister. And we had it in our first reading in your Pacificum Guide, but it's these things. We believe in the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, the leadership of Jesus, salvation by character, and the progress of mankind onward and upward forever. James Freeman Clarke is a different person, but it sums up the points that you read in William Channing Gannett's Unitarian Christianity sermon he gave at Baltimore. It really does sum up all of the points that he covered. Because he did cover in the first part the unity of God, that God is one, that God is also this understanding that God is this, if we believe that God is all loving and all omniscient, then God is this kind of perfect, separated from humanity being that is different than what it means to be a human being. He then goes on into Jesus not being of two persons, of being both God and human, that God and human are inherently separate, and therefore Jesus is a man and a prophet instead of being God itself. So we believe in the fatherhood of God, the leadership of Jesus, automatically connotates that there is the oneness of God, not the Trinity, that this is perfect kind of other being, as well as Jesus being a person. Because Jesus is a person, then Channing Gannett goes into, well, then if we don't believe that Jesus is God, what is his salvific character? It wouldn't probably be that he died. If he was God, maybe that would be different, but we don't actually believe that. We believe it's the way he lived his life, the way that he is a prophet proclaimed the love of God, the way that he is a prophet showed us what it means to feed the multitude and to be a good person. So that goes into both the leadership of Jesus, but also what saves us, being good people and following the leadership of Jesus, being able to live in a way that showcases those characters in our own selves, which then goes towards believing that we have the potential to really shape the world for the future. All of these things really were connotated by William Channing Gannett and Reverend James Freeman Clarke, and they basically are the basis for early Unitarian belief. So there's a summary. Before I recognize time, but before I go on, are there questions from that sum up? Are there things that you're thinking of now that I've said that kind of summary of Unitarianism?
That was a good summary. Thank you. And we've got plenty of time.
Do you think any of that has relevance for today's faith?
Well, I think it has huge relevance. It's basically the way that my journey into Unitarian Universalism came about, was coming from Calvinist churches. In reading the teachings of Jesus, just had a deep desire to want to live by those teachings, to be a good person and a person full of love. And that's not, there weren't a whole lot of Christians around me that were thinking in those terms. It was all about, you're forgiven because of Christ's blood and therefore you go to heaven. And so how you act in this world was not of great relevance. And there were some not so good things, that were done. Not everybody, certainly not condemning, but it was a rough enough experience, pretty rough. And I think when we finally were invited into a Unitarian Universalist church and had the courage to go, and sit in, we're desiring to be good people. This is what we have been wanting, and we didn't expect it to come from a theology so unholy, from our background. But they actually did want to live out the teachings of Jesus in this life was important, having justice and love now here. So I think it has huge relevance.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts?
Or questions for those of you. Other questions?
I guess I would ask, like, if we could flesh out a little bit more the idea that it's really, because I think there is some beauty coming from the background I did. There is some beauty that man, well, this is not beautiful, that man can't reach God because we're depraved, right? I'm not saying that's beautiful. But the fact that if that were true, that a God would actually sacrifice himself to save man, I mean, there is some beauty in that, and yet the idea that God is one and that he gave Christ as the example of the highest moral living that we can attain in connection with God. I don't know, I wondered if you all had some thoughts on that.
Sure. So I'm gonna separate out those two questions for a minute, because we're gonna talk a little bit more about sacrifice and universalism. Mainly because universalism, I'll talk briefly about how they weren't actually, Jose Ballou and John Murray were not on the same page. So I'm going to move that for now. But when it comes to Unitarianism and the role, it actually gets into the questions that we specifically are asked to reflect on for today. So as you might have read in William Ellery Channing, which is different than William Channing Gannett, comes later. William Ellery Channing does indicate that in his Unitarianism, the proper role of humanity is to pursue likeness to God. So in his example of Jesus as prophet, but not God, as being a human being, he was kind of the perfect example of human morality. He was the example of what it means to get as close to God as possible. And the highest example of what we're supposed to live on. I think the worries in Unitarianism, as far as the worries today, which we'll actually get into later in liberation theology, as well as womanism, is that having a sacrifice of Jesus puts it as if sacrifice is perfection. To sacrifice yourself is holy, and that is really damaging and not really beautiful. And as far as Unitarians believe, that was also the case. He's like, why would an all-loving God sacrifice his only son? That's horrible. It's horrible to have someone willingly suffer and die like that in a way that's torture. Instead, for Unitarian beliefs, they really did rely on the fact that the enemies of sin or evil or of the state, the people who wanted to deny the word and goodness of God, were the forces that killed Jesus, not an all-loving, all-knowing God, and that was actually regulated to human beings and to human actions by making Jesus human. Right. So that's one of the reasons why Unitarians, in their logic, I believe, I might not be saying the exact reasoning that's in the tomes of books of William Channing Gannett and others, but that's one of the reasons why they were like, no, Jesus is human, because a God would not die in torture like this willingly. Right. Also because by separating out the human from the God, we do get this example that salvation, it really does go to salvation being like humans can attain a likeness to God. We can access at least some understanding of divinity to be able to live a good and moral life. And that's what sets the stage for next week's class about transcendentalism, where it actually goes there. It goes there, that human beings can access the divine, right? We're not there yet. We're here in having the role model of Jesus being human morality. So in today's questions, I'm just going to read this. Channing indicates the proper role of humanity is to pursue likeness to God. Channing believed that the crucial purpose of our relationship with Jesus was to follow Jesus' example of the model of the highest moral life humans can achieve, so we can become even more imbued with the virtues like love, like justice, like compassion that are perfected in God. Therefore, my question to all of you is, well, do you have a role model for the highest example of human morality? Do you think so do you have a role model, or what do you think about that question? Like, is there something problematic with that question? I'll let you chew on that for a while.
People are inherently flawed. Just putting that out there. We hear of, modern people being put up as paragons for society, like Mother Teresa, and we found out that she was actually pretty, I think there was a lot of racism and some other stuff going on that wasn't well publicized, and Gandhi had problems with young women that we didn't know about. And these are names that if you say, like Mother Teresa, people don't all know the flaws. They just hear the goodness aspects of it, and they're like, okay, well, this person is this great person, but I don't think you're going to find anyone that is solely and only a great person without something somewhere that isn't. So you can have your human role models, but know that there's not always going to be a perfect one.
I really appreciate that you said that. I'm going to hold that thought because I have a response to that highlights a great thing, but I really appreciate that you said that. It's a good reflection. Anybody else have a reflection to that question?
This is Margie. I think that, along the same lines, I think there's aspects of different people that would be a role model, but you'd have to put lots of people together. Part of this person to emulate that type of behavior.
Great, thank you. Anybody else? Patricia, do you have any thoughts on this?
I really agree with what Jenny had to say. And when I was thinking about, okay, who's my role model, and Martin Luther King comes to mind for me, and what comes to mind sort of in this frame is that we recognize that he was flawed all along, that he never was held up as a personal example of high morality, but he represented a core belief that was pretty beloved community. So to me, it's like taking it away from the embodiment of an individual to what are the beliefs that they fought and lived and died for.
But when you have those beliefs and what people fight and die for, ultimately you do have figureheads of some kind
Right.
that people try to identify with.
Yeah. Yeah.
And those who don't agree with them are going to take those flaws and magnify them for those to support their side, so to speak. I'm not saying he wasn't a good leader.
No.
That's not what I'm saying at all.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I think that we're seeing that play out now in politics. I mean, absolutely. Everything is magnified, every little bit of every person that's good or bad. And I think that happens in general when we're looking at leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I just want to note that in Unitarian Universalism, we have a fascination with role models, especially historically. Even we're talking about them today, William Channing, Ellery Channing. Like, even think about the readings and the language of the readings that we used. William Ellery Channing was given a very good review in that reading we had. He's not always given that generous of a review, okay? We have other people, come on, you know the people we shout out about, right? Ralph Waldo Emerson, Olympia Brown, Susan Anthony, right? And of course, they're also flawed, right? So I want to highlight that because I know sometimes we have a tendency of falling into role models in our faith. You've already hinted at the next question, so I'm just going to go ahead and ask it. Well, what do you think about the nature of human beings? Are we inherently good? Are we inherently flawed? Is it more nature? Is it more nurture? What's rolling around in your head as we talk about this together?
I think you have to go into every encounter with anybody hoping for their best and accepting that they may not be there that day.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, like when we put, at our services we say, or we used to, I don't think we do it so much anymore. Our services, this might not be the one you're looking for, come back, our services aren't exactly the same all the time, some kind of wording like that. And I think when we're talking about being with people, regardless of what level they're at, whether they're coming in to learn, whether they're coming in to teach, we have to take that lens and know that even though we're hoping for the best, we might not get it. And we have to accept that maybe even in ourselves, we're not always giving out what we hope to be. So forgiveness.
Wow, that's powerful.
It's not easy, but I feel like I'm in my building right now, so I'm in my building again, and with the new role that I'm taking, I see a lot of people, so it's not always easy, but yeah, and you go back and you try again. But people will also show you who they are over time.
Anyone else? I know this is a large question.
My experience in religious education, starting, I've been around for about 25 years, and, generations of parenting. There was a time, and I don't think we're in that time so much anymore, but there was a time where parents really wanted to shield their children from the bad and the flawed. And for me, that's part of the nature of who we are. And, that question of how do we deal with evil? that we've been struggling with. I think we've been struggling with for a long time, maybe decades, maybe centuries, but more specifically, we've been struggling with that question, the evil question, since 9/11. And maybe that's my perspective, being kind of in the metro area where, it really impacted us very deeply and viscerally. But parents wanted to shield their children from this idea of there is evil out there. And they wanted that in the RE program. Oh, we can't talk about death. We can't talk about, and we have to have a vision that is more reflective of all of human experience, because that's how we give our children and our youth especially tools when they inevitably have to when they face that. So I don't know what I'm saying. I'm babbling a little bit. I got lost. I think you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Currently, the majority of my RE exposure with the children tends to be during wisdom stories. And one of the things I struggle with at the moment is, whatever I pick has to be perfectly fine on its own without any follow-up. And I don't, we're at family worship, but it really wasn't modeled well in my congregation this year. So there is no, let's elaborate on this. And my last example of this is we did the Easter and Passover story, and we did the story of Jesus's resurrection because that's what the minister chose. And we had these kids in who normally don't come to service. They're about 5, and they're like, he died? And that was all that they probably took away from that. And there wasn't really any, I heard them. I don't know if their parents heard them. So I tried to reach out and talk to that parent. But if I'm doing that, I can't always reach out individually, especially if I'm not catching it, to lead those kinds of conversations. And I know we're empowering our parents to do those things, but that's only if they're going to read your emails and follow up when you don't know what they're doing at home. So how do we present these bigger topics without the opportunity to work on them together?
Yeah, I'm reminded of, there's a new book out called After the Good News by the Reverend Nancy McDonald Ladd.
I'm going to talk to you.
And she has a quote where she said, we go right to Easter, we skip over Good Friday and go right to Easter in Unitarian Universalism. So I think it's a question that's getting some attention and being wrestled with in the larger Unitarian Universalist world.
So I'm going to follow up on that because that does lead me to 2 of my points for Unitarianism specifically, right? I will say that in Unitarianism, the theological understanding of the nature of human beings is good. Mm-hmm. And it's there. I do not see in any of the readings that we were given, except maybe theologically and by treatise, like in a general, like rational philosophy perspective, real good treatment of sin in Unitarian theology, like written theology. I do not see it, right? And I'll say no. I will highlight the context of the birth of Unitarianism. The context when we were born is that everybody else was dealing with sin real well. We were talking about, literally in the words of John Edwards, which is a very famous Calvinist theologian, a Puritan at the time, at any moment, the fires of hell might open under your feet and swallow you whole because you were automatically sinful. Mm-hmm. So you can see in that theology where everyone anywhere can be eaten up by hellfire in the judgment of God, like reversing that and actually proclaiming, no, human beings are good. We are inherently full of goodness and worthiness because of God is radical. It's a radical statement. And to proclaim the goodness of humanity is something that was mind-blowing and changing for people, as well as a way to have them practically be able to do something, to live into social justice. So there are some really good benefits of that, right? We focus on assuming good intentions. We focus on the ability to do social justice, on living a good and moral life is incredibly valuable. And also, what's happened since the Puritans is that we've, as is outlined in After the Good News, a majority white, educated, male Enlightenment period ate it up. Like, oh yes, of course we're good and we're perfectible and we can have this progress of humanity upwards and onwards if you're comfortable and white and can skip over sin and suffering really easily and can live a life that gives you all the benefits to make you not question the goodness of humanity. It's easy. It's easy to believe in goodness and perfectibility when you're comfortable and live in privilege. So what I love about After the Good News, but also in what's happening in our faith right now, is we are starting to question some of the things that came from these early writers of Unitarian and Universalist roots. Yes, they were white, they were male, they lived in a different time that gave them different privileges that made it so that the perfectibility of humanity was inevitable, was just a thing that could be proven, instead of something that actually needs to be called into question as part of being white supremacy, honestly. Part of being the culture that has grown into it, right? I said a lot. What are you thinking? I know it's hard to talk about, because I know it can bring some real emotions for at least my congregation when I talk about it. So how are you thinking and feeling? Should I take that as are we feeling good? Is there, like, any questions?
We can take our 5-minute break, and if folks have a minute to get up and walk around and have something come to them when we come back before we move into the Universalists, we can do that, unless somebody has some immediate thoughts.
Well, I will just end saying one thing. Even as a minister today, it's hard, because many people are like, oh, we're Universalists, we're free Universalists, Universalists great, because Universalism really is being recentered for lots of wonderful reasons that we'll go into in the next section. But I am a Unitarian. I was raised as a Unitarian. I grew up reading, loving Ralph Waldo Emerson, and even for myself, yes, I still do believe that at the heart of all hearts, theologically, people have the potential and rest and are born of love, that they are inherently good. Yes, people are flawed. Yes, people run away from that. But when it comes down to all the last final things, I do believe in these Unitarian principles, that we always have the potential to continue to choose love, to grow into love, and to change for the better. So here's my cards on the table for y'all.
What a good way to segue into a short 5-minute break. Thanks, Emily. This was great conversation. So we'll be back at 2:06. So take as much time as you need with universalism. You know, I think we have 25 minutes, but if you need to go over, because I think the Sunday school address and some of that, I don't think we really need 25 minutes for that. So if you need more time, don't sweat.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Are we ready to go, everybody?
We're starting to come back. Jenny's here.
This is Margie. I'll be there in just a minute.
Okay, now.
Of course. Thank you. Pat, I can't, because of my tablet screen, I can't see when everyone's back, so just let me know when I can start, okay?
Yeah, we're still waiting for Ashley and Margie.
Fantastic.
Well, if you want to give it another minute, or you can. I did put a link to the book After the Good News for anybody who's interested in that. It's a great book. It's you know, one of those little, it's about 120 pages, so it's a somewhat easy read with lots of challenging truth. So. All right, Ashley's back. Margie said she would be back, so I'd say go ahead and start when you're ready.
All right, everybody. So my first, it's going to be the same sort of setup. I'll ask you first what you took from it, give a little summary, ask its relevance, and then go into the questions from the description. So what are, for those who might have reflected on the readings, or for anyone who knows about some of the early Universalists, what are some things that stood out for you?
I guess again, the severity of those who believe differently from the doctrine, the mainline doctrine of the time. If you believed a universalist theology, you were kicked out, and it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, it's real. Especially when I think about the Universalists in a time, again, when it's just being taught that God was an angry, judgmental being who at any time could strike you down and you were inherently depraved. How radical just saying, no, God loves you. No, it doesn't make sense for an all-loving God to not love people, right? It feels simple today, but how radical it was for the 1800s is real. Anyone else?
So I was struck by how some of the, you know, centuries old writings on universalism are really sounded somewhat modern. I thought that some of them, there's a lot of similarity to some of the expressions of Unitarian Universalism today, and an appreciation for sort of the pluralistic way of looking at religion. So it felt more open than the Unitarians in some ways. And I was raised Unitarian, so full disclosure, raised in a church that still calls itself Unitarian. So, but I also feel like when we're out in the world, this is the side of ourselves and our theology that we want the world to know about us or see, rather than that Unitarian side.
Ooh, that's fascinating. I'd love to we'll dig into that a little bit more. Yeah. Any other thoughts? So I just preached about Hosea Ballou on Pride Sunday, actually. And I told people, sometimes reading this stuff, it seems like, that was 200 years ago. What relevance does it have today? But think about the evangelical voices that are in our politics today. Think about the messages that are going around our politics about who is worthy, who is, coming into our country and messing it up, or who is, worthy of God's love, who are sinful. It's still alive and well all over the place. And so preaching the simpleness of, we just don't, I actually encountered this with someone who was a funeral director coming into our church, asking, what happens and you're in church, and then all of a sudden everyone wants to ask you, what is this church? What is your university? Then you get into this theological discussion you never thought you were going to have. Yeah, that happens to me all the time. And one of them was this rather Catholic Staten Islander who's like, so wait, well, where do people go? Like, don't they have to go to hell if they're going to live well? And I was saying, as Unitarians, we just don't believe that an all-loving God would ever punish anyone to hell. He was quiet very fast. But it's still relevant today. It's still a radical message for many people. And I find it fascinating. So as a summary, I'm going to give just a little bit of a summary of the Universalists, not Unitarians, Universalists, early founders. Honestly, it seems very simple that Universalists believed that in the Christian tradition, there's universal salvation. There is no hell, but all-loving God would not condemn anyone to hell. There's a little bit of a difference, though, that I do want to highlight. Hosea Ballou and John Murray actually were different. They founded the American Unitarian tradition together, but they were at odds theologically from what is called ultra-universalists versus restorationists. And you might have picked this up a little bit on John Murray. John Murray seems to be what I would call a very Christian universalist, because he still believed in the Trinity. He argued about the Trinity. He argued about God's love, but he also did believe in purgatory. So restorationists are those who believe that for a finite amount of time after someone dies, they have to reconcile with God about the sins they've committed in their life. So they go to a style of purgatory, but it's not forever. Eventually, no matter what, everyone will be joined and reconciled to God and be in heaven and be saved. So it's still a version of universalism. It still does believe in the end everyone gets saved, but it's a little different because there's a part of restoration. There is a section of the afterlife that has to account for the sins that have happened in life. Hosea Ballou is very different and much more, at least in the times, radical, because one, as it says in our reading, he didn't believe in the Trinity and made arguments against it, so it was, in essence, somewhat of a Unitarian. But he's also what's considered an ultra-universalist. He believed that no matter what, God's infinite power and God's infinite love, being different than humans' mortal, finite mistakes, would instantly, in his power, erase or at least reconcile the sins of humans instantaneously. So it's also fondly known of, and you'll actually see t-shirts at GA sold like this, death and glory. So after you die is all God's glory. You enter the glory of heaven, you enter the glory of God's universal salvation. And John Murray does go, so that's the founding understanding of universal salvation. John Murray goes into this a little bit, but Hosea Ballou goes into it a lot more, that, well, if you're saved, then like that guy that Catholic man who asked me, so then what are you supposed to do character-wise? Like, if you're automatically saved, like, what keeps you a moral being? And Hosea Ballou goes into it a little bit more. There's a very famous story you might have taught about in RE where someone asked him, like, if a thief comes by and steals your wallet, if there's a universalist, like, what's the point? Like, aren't they just going to be saved? Everything's going to be fine. And he's like, if that man was a universalist, he would have never done it in the first place. This understanding that Hosea Ballou really writes out elegantly and for, 40, 50 pages about how believing in your own salvation and goodness brings you closer to acting in a good and moral life. What I find interesting is you can already see how Universalists and Unitarians are cousins, right? And it is summed up by Thomas Starr King, whether or not it's misquoted or quoted, I'm not exactly sure, but the quote that says, Unitarians believe that humanity is too good to condemn, and Universalists believe that God is too good to condemn humanity. And also, that's a very important distinction to make. I understand that our first principle says the inherent worth and dignity of every person. That does come from our universal belief that God loves everyone and does redeem everyone. And also, Universalists believe that people were sinful. They believe that people were evil, that people were flawed, and that they needed to be reconciled to God. What they believed is that God was so loving and so perfect and so infinite that reconciliation was easy. This is different than Unitarians, who believe that humanity was good and would live to be good and would continue to work to be good so that they could be reconciled and let into heaven with God. Unitarians, I'm not sure, most of them didn't believe in hell, but some of them could, at least theoretically, believe in hell, right? So that is a distinction to make, especially when I think about the future and the merger and various things, because sometimes I think people believe it's universalism that makes it hard for us to talk about evil and sin. But actually, Universalists, they know about sin, and they talk about it a lot. They know that human beings make a mess, that it's humans that make up this horrible world, and sorry, I may be exaggerating, but at least in their words, they might say, humans are making the mess. It is God's love that ends up reconciling all. Okay, that's a overall summary. In my own words, take it with a grain of salt. What are your thoughts? Well, I'm going to let you chew on that a little bit more, but I'm going to dive into the larger questions that our discussion gives to us. We talked a lot in these early studies. Sometimes it can seem a little removed from where we are right now because we're using traditional theological Christian language, such as sin, such as salvation. And in this part, at least with Universalists, salvation is a big deal. So how about you? What do you define as salvation? Do you like the term? Do you not like the term? And if you think that there is salvation, well, what is being saved looks like?
I guess I was surprised that Channing, I don't hear the word salvation much spoken about in the Unitarian Universalist churches that I've been in much. That was interesting to me. It would seem to me that, and I guess I would want a clarification if this is what he would think, or if we have changed how we think about it today as an association. Just that salvation would be the riddance of any ability that we would have to harm someone else, that we would live in that plane of goodness, that we would always be doing good to ourselves and others. But I also wanted to go back to the question you had before, if that's okay, and you can separate it out if you want. But I think historically Christianity has said that hell would be just the absence of God, and that anyone who would go to hell would be someone who doesn't want to be with God, doesn't want to choose to be good. So I guess I'm wondering if Unitarians would then say that no one would choose that because humanity is inherently good. How does that correspond with an idea of free will? Does that inhibit it in any way? We can't choose to be bad, I guess. We wouldn't want to. I'm just curious.
So I'm going to separate out those two questions, but I'll answer. I think you're on the right track of asking some really good questions about Unitarianism. I will say that Unitarianism doesn't handle the existence of hell very well, at least in its theological writings of any of the treaties that I found before. Trust me, it might be somewhere from individual speakers, but I don't see a really good theological stance on hell in any one of them, other than maybe a notion of universalism occasionally, because they did believe in an all-loving, all-unified God, right? As far as free will, reason and conscience and choosing freely is a big part of the Unitarian faith. It really is. It's what makes people able to be like God. They have to actively choose to be good. So having free will is a very important part of Unitarianism, which means I don't know if it plays how theodicy or like hell or various things work with that lens. I think more it's this understanding that at the base of humanity is this seed of goodness, and then from there you have the free will to choose whether you follow it or not, much like almost you said, like other older Christians would do, which is you can choose to be close to God or you can choose to, etc. That would be similar, just in a little bit of a different way than the Puritans were necessarily saying at the time, right? Kind of the flipping of the coin. Instead of being inherently depraved and choosing either to be away from God, we're inherently good and more likely to choose to be with God. But it's still free will. Okay. That's the sum up of that as far as I can tell from Channing's writings and other Unitarians. There was the other question about universalism you said that I probably forgot. Can you repeat yourself?
Sorry, my internet connection is spotty. So, were you asking me to?
Sorry, I know you're breaking up a lot, but I'm trying to remember the question you asked about universalism.
If you have access to the chat, Ashley, you could type it in. That may work. Jenny or Margie, does this notion, this idea of salvation, is that something that ever kind of comes up in conversation or in your work? Do people, maybe, people who come in from other faith of origin, are they like confused by what we say or don't say? Have you encountered that?
You
Uh,
know, go ahead, Margie.
in our church, it's not really mentioned, talked about. Really, hardly any parts of Christianity or Judaism are addressed in our church. Our children will say, I never heard of God, what's that? Or my friend says they believe in God, what is God? And so there's very little discussion of God in religious education. The program really shies away from talking about that. Every once in a while, you might have something about Moses or something, but it's not put in context. Yep, you got it. What is God? We actually had our young ones one time talk about what they do believe in. And these are probably 4th, 5th graders. And one little boy said, I believe in God. And he held up a great big flip chart page in front of the congregation and said that. And it was like gasps. So we don't really talk about it. And therefore, we don't get into the hell and heaven and purgatory and all of that kind of stuff. I think that's a problem with our program, because they need to know the history. They know a lot about other world religions, but not our own. So this little boy tried to explain the Trinity, and his mother promptly said, we are Unitarians. We do not believe in a Trinity. You're not allowed to think about that. So yeah, we don't really address it. I talk with other adults less often. It's more with the children and their parents. And the parents have the Unitarian Universalist thought processes for the most part. And they've never asked why we don't talk about God. Jenny?
We also don't appear to talk about salvation or any of that much in our congregation. And to be fair, I've spent a good part of the last decade teaching RE classes during service. So if it had been mentioned, I may have missed it. And this year I've been in service this year more often than I have in all previous years combined, because we moved to family worship this year and aren't holding RE at the same time. I guess there's benefits for that. So, hey, but with that, personal experience, my daughter is 8 and she's like, I think I believe in God, Mom. Yeah, this is a couple months ago. I'm like, okay, well, what do you, and so we started talking a little bit about, and she's just like, well, there's got to be someone, right? And so we don't really have a good guidance. My husband was Catholic growing up and questioned and stopped around, high school. He went to Catholic school all the way through. I am heavily atheist and probably humanist. I learn and discover more. So there's not a whole questioning what is God thing going on in my house a whole lot. And by that, I'm taking my personal experience, because I don't have it really asked in my classes at all by any of these kids that we've taught over the years. We teach them about people, we teach them about feelings, we teach them about events, we teach them about other religions. Now, I taught primarily very young kids, and I do recall that our slightly older kids, around the same age, I think, Margie, you said 4th, 5th grade, that you were talking about. I think there's a time traveler program that was being run here for a while I think that explored more of the Bible itself and those the people in the Bible and those topics. So I think some of our youth are getting it somewhere, and then they're making decisions and coming of age exploration after they've gone to neighboring faiths. I haven't been part of that conversation. And for me personally, salvation isn't a question because it's not part of what I believe in. But I need to know these things and what other people think about them.
So I want to, sorry.
I was brought up Catholic, straight Irish Catholic. However, my mother was Presbyterian and didn't go to church. And it's strange now that she does go to a Catholic church and a Presbyterian after my father has passed. So, but
community.
Yes, community. So, but we also believe that, you know, people who weren't Catholic went to hell and they burned up. And so it was always difficult to, well, what about mom? She's not going to hell, of course. And I think that's when I veered off toward Unitarian Universalism. It just didn't fit. So
we had a visitor a few weeks ago who was raised Catholic. His wife is former Mennonite. And while they were away for a couple of weeks this summer, he decided to go church shopping. So popped into our service, happened to sit for UU Basics, which we were holding immediately afterwards. I was not a part of that one, but you know, I ended up talking with him, and he was just like, well, there's the things, the Catholic parts where people aren't good to each other, and there's just too many unresolved things. And we talked about the 7 principles. And it was like, oh, like he had like everyone talking to him because you know what it is in the summer with a smaller service. And oh, new person, hey. So, you know, we have had someone asking those questions recently. But the topic of salvation itself didn't come up in any of our conversations. So more so is, what do you believe and what are your, you know, what do you teach the kids? And that was the kind of questions we were answering.
So mindful of time, I'm just gonna say a few things to that point. I know I'm very aware that in our UU culture, we do not actively talk about salvation. Part of me believes, this is a wild guess, so it's not like theologically based, but part of me believes basically that universalism opened the foundation to assume that everyone gets saved. Because the assumption became, well, God loves everyone, everyone's saved, then we're not going to talk about salvation because it's already a matter of fact, right? And it actually led the foundation for things that would come later, like humanism and transcendentalism, which we will talk about next week. Because there was this understanding that God is a loving force and that human beings are inherently worthy, that's all you need to lay the foundation of humanism. And I think what's hard to understand in our congregations that are very humanist, one, because we have so many people that are hurt by Christian traditions that come into our doors and therefore don't want to hear about salvation or God or religious language. But what's hard to reconcile is that without these histories, without Unitarianism and Universalism, we wouldn't have humanism. The humanism and the faith that we know today would not exist had it not been for these kind of basic, what I feel like Christian questions, which then evolved into wider questions about what it means to be human, what it means to be good to each other, what it means to relate to each other. Right? So the question we're not going to get to, I'm not going to get to this now, but also it's going to be a question we're going to ask also in future classes. What is evil? What is sin? What does it mean to be evil in the world? And honestly, both Unitarian and Universalism to some extent, but also our faith itself right now, Unitarian Universalism, we don't do a good job of talking about it. We don't really talk about, unless it's injustice. We're great at talking about injustice. We can talk about evil that way. But we don't really have a good theological or a good conversation about like what happens when we really do harm people. What happens to when people suffer? We don't have a good theology that really points, well, this is why, or that, you know, especially like I can understand why our enemies of old, the Puritans, might have come up with an angry and judgmental God when people were dying of disease and hungry and, left in the cold and suffering for long periods of time. By affirming God's all-loving, we did a lot of wondrous things and also didn't really answer, well, ouch. There's a lot of evil and a lot of sin. Where does that come from? There are universalists that address it. Jose Ballou does talk about evil and sin. I don't know if we're talking about Clarence Skinner in our next class. I'm guessing we're not. But I will say the best understanding for me of a Unitarian Universalist original root of what it means to have evil in the world is Clarence Skinner. Mm-hmm. Social Implications of Universalism. Fantastic read if you ever have a chance.
If you want, so we have plenty of space in our schedule. If you want to go ahead and finish this conversation, we can defer the conversation about sort of the historical theological roots of religious instruction and put that together with our conversation around Sophia Lyon-Fahs. If you want to, we have 20 minutes left. So do you want to just finish up here? I mean, I feel like we've really dug in. So I kind of hate to let it go.
What do you all think?
I know not everybody's had a chance to do the reading for the religious instruction anyway. Do you want to stick with evil? We've got about another 15 minutes, so why don't we go ahead and do that?
Okay.
Yeah.
So has your church, in your RA settings, have you actually talked about evil? Have you had encounters where you've had to figure out, or even the word sin? Have you ever had to talk about that in your settings?
We've had children ask, well, what about these bad guys that shoot people? And especially after some of the more recent events in the last, 5 years or so. And aren't they bad guys? How can we respect them? And they'll go through the principles and say, how can we do this? Shouldn't we just kill them or lock them up in jail or something? So they're thinking about, people as, are they good? Are they bad? And what do we do about the bad ones? How can we follow our principles when we encounter something like that? They're not following them.
It's so real, Margie. I've actually had a conversation with a member who said the first principle is the hardest one for me to follow, and I don't know if I believe in it. She's like, how can I believe in the inherent goodness of, well, sorry to make this political, of someone like Donald Trump? How do I believe in the inherent goodness of, of this person or that person whose behavior is very bad or who's continually profited off of other people and injustice? I'm like, I don't have an answer for that. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like, we had this optimism and this arc bending towards justice way of seeing the world. And I think that in Unitarian Universalist congregations, this idea of evil, there are people in the world who do evil among us, not the others, has been something that has emerged.
And yet that's such a hard conversation when we talk about safe congregations all the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when we talk about diversity and welcoming strangers,
Of course we welcome.
Radical hospitality, how does that all fit into the puzzle?
Who did that, guys? We think we are. We're not. And yeah, so yeah.
I do have to highlight from your conversation. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Patricia. I want to highlight that I feel like with the conversations we've finally been brave enough to really start having around white supremacy, we actually do have a language of sin that's coming back.
Mm-hmm.
You have a way of talking about separating out behaviors and systems and inherent, like, people, right? There are, and that difference. What Margie was saying about, like, the bad people versus the good people. We're always trained, especially in our society, to not divorce people and behavior. I think we're starting to see that there's a difference between people and their behavior, and we're starting to name systems and structures we've been born into that talk about evil. What I think is very funny is that Clarence Skinner actually talks about that. Anyway, sorry, that's my little plug for him. But, like, we're actually starting to really widely, as a UU faith, talk about, yeah, there is sin, and that looks like structural systemic racism, supremacy, sexism, patriarchy, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And we can choose to continue to stay in those systems, or we can choose to continually try our best to fight and acknowledge those systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Going back to sin and evil in itself, I think that with that whole, I guess what I'm trying to say is that people don't like knowing that there's no answer for something. So to say that we are, oh, that's a sin, why do these bad things happen? And you're like, sometimes stuff just does. Again, it goes back to that no control over a situation. And people don't like to know that they don't have control over something. Even free-spirited people are like, well, I get to make these choices. Well, okay, your choices sometimes mean nothing. And so even though we have free will, your free will doesn't always equate to what you want to happen. So it's a difficult thing for, I think, a lot of people to wrap their heads around. And it's not something, oh, why does this thing happen? Why do the school shootings happen? And again, we go back to, each person is important. And to touch on your topic of, and I'm bouncing around a little bit here, I apologize, but Emily, with your politics bit, for me, I see friends who are liberal, I fall into that category, and they call our president a Cheeto. And I'm like, well, I don't do that out of respect for the fact that he's a person, and we shouldn't be insulting him on who he is, appearance-wise, otherwise, so on and so forth. I don't use any of that language, and that's my own personal, because I follow that, each person is important. Do I absolutely love anything else that he's done? Probably. That's a good resounding no. But I have to pay respect to the fact that he's a fellow person. And not be insulting.
So I think you're highlighting something, I'll talk very, very briefly. You're highlighting something about the difference between their existing evil, what we think about the existence of evil, but also what we do in the face of evil, right? The first principle, or the inherent worth and dignity of every person, it is a faith statement. It's not a statement based on fact or on evidence on people's behavior. It's a faith statement, and a statement about how we should act in the world.
And I told my sister today, I have faith in humanity, and sometimes it fails me, and then I keep believing in it. So if that isn't faith, I don't know what is.
Yep. Others' thoughts?
I think going back to what we were talking about with role models and how there's no perfect role models, I think there is a sense in which it's very difficult to sometimes rise above the norm of the culture around us, or even be able to see the wrong that's in that culture at the time. So you may be thinking you're doing right, and then in a future time the whole pervasive idea of a certain place is called into question. I think I also have I have a question just about how do we reconcile like severe imperfections just in the universe, such as, you know, in things that we deal with, such as, let's say, you know, sicknesses, things like that, that aren't necessarily, even though they can be socially, communally caused, but they're not necessarily that way. And just the idea of a good God allowing humanity to suffer so severely in ways like that. It's an age-old question.
It is an age-old question. I actually had a fellow person in my philosophy major in undergrad do an entire senior thesis on that question itself. And it deals with the big theological word is theodicy, which is specifically not just about human suffering and human injustice with each other. It is about how could God, a good and all-loving God, allow there to be natural disasters of suffering, right? Like illness, like sickness, like the natural disasters we've seen with climate change, though we are now questioning whether that's human-born or God-born done, right? But those are really big questions for anyone who believes in an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God. The question of theodicy, how suffering exists in the world, is an ongoing one that has been tried to be answered and honestly failed to be answered by almost every person and every theologian throughout the beginnings of this conversation, right? In some ways, I think that's why there's a temptation for those, I'm going to try to word this right. I might not word this perfectly, so please forgive me if I accidentally say something not right. I sometimes find in humanists, scientists, atheists, or agnostics, this way of being like, well, you know, if you have God out of the equation, it's just what it is, right? It makes it easier for me just to not believe in God because of all the suffering, and it's just a scientific explanation. And I would push back on that, being like, whether or not it's a scientific explanation, whether or not you believe in God, it's a hard question. What is the purpose of suffering is still a hard question to answer, no matter what theological point of view that you do. And I will say, UUs haven't answered it well. In fact, we want to kind of go past suffering. We want to not think about suffering, in fact. We don't really do a good job of answering it. When we are in person together, we're going to be talking about liberation theologies, and liberation theologies will sit with the suffering as an unanswered mystery that's important for us to confront, as something that's important to what it means to be human. So we'll have more answers, or at least more questions to that soon.
Wow, we've got a few minutes left. Any final thoughts or final questions?
I keep looking at the sidebar where the questions are typed, and it's, do you see salvation as something that people create for themselves? And on a very simplistic level, talking about if you don't believe in a higher power, so to speak, and you're not in a good situation, I think that goes back to the whole bootstraps, only the deserving raise themselves out. And I think that that's a very flawed way of thinking. So it's that question just keeps popping out to me with that for some reason. And I don't think it's a healthy thought to have in the way that people create that which they deserve. To a certain extent, yes. And to a certain extent, no. Because again, sometimes things happen that are beyond our control. So we can work for that which we hope to attain, achieve, and so forth. But note that your hopes and aspirations aren't always going to be what you want them to be.
you're also pointing out something that gets forgotten when we talk about salvation. At least Unitarians, when they say salvation by character, it is a very individualist. When you build your character, you will save yourself by modeling your life in the moral life of Jesus. It forgets a principle we added much later in our lineage, interdependence.
Mm-hmm.
Salvation, actually, if we believe in interdependence, salvation isn't created by yourself. It's created by the collective of people by relationship. Rebecca Parker goes into that more in her works recently, whether that's Blessing the World or a lot of her other books. She will go into that more as her understanding of salvation.
And when you are failing those around you in that web, which I think is a very big conversation we're all having now in the larger UU world.
Ooh, interesting. I don't have an answer for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the one thing I want to leave you with, I know we don't have enough time to think about this fully, but do you see how these roots, we've talked about Unitarianism already, but do you see how Universalism may be alive in our denomination today? Don't, like, just a nod or just to, like, I don't know.
All right.
I wanted to leave you with that because sometimes Unitarian Universalists, especially those who are very humanist, are like, why do we have to talk about our Christian roots? Why have to talk about what is the relevance of Unitarianism or Universalism, blah, blah, blah. That was the past, today's the present.
But that's the foundation.
Everything. Sorry. Yes, Jeannie, yes. Sorry, no, talk.
Oh, no, I was just agreeing with you, but that's the foundation. So that's...
It is not only our foundation, but it's still alive. Look at our principles. The first principle wouldn't exist without universalism.
Right.
The principles about the free and responsible search for truth wouldn't happen without the Unitarian belief in reason and conscience. Like, Unitarian and Universalism is written all over the Seven Principles. It is there if you look closely. It's a theological framework, a theological house, which we'll talk about when we're in person together, that makes up what we are now. It is living and breathing. It has changed over the years. It has been influenced and molded by the theologies that will come. But this foundation, you'll see these principles enter into transcendentalism, humanism, James Luther Adams' thoughts. You'll even see some of these things reflected in liberation theology, in process theology. This is the foundation of what came after. So no matter whether or not you talk about Unitarian Universalism, it'll show up in those humanist churches. They just won't know what it is or what it looks like.
That's funny. All right. Well, thank you, Emily. I so appreciate just not only kind of the breadth of all that you have brought, but the enthusiasm with which you have brought it. So I really appreciate that. So in our last 5 minutes, I have a short reading to close us out, but also I will send you an email to update you on the readings, but you can assume that whatever is in the book for session 3 will be the reading that we hope that you will be able to do in preparation for our last webinar, which I think is August 7th. I think that this session is the most difficult reading of the whole thing, just because of the language difference, the syntax and the grammar, and just sort of it becomes a little, you're processing not only concept, but you're processing the structure and the form. So I think there are still many interesting and challenging concepts to come, but I hope that they will be a little bit more easily digestible for you. If you weren't able to do the reading for this time, I encourage you, to go back and try to do that, just because it's, again, it's a foundation. It really is a foundation for all that is going to come, even if it's just skimming it. So Any questions about the assignment or next time? Well, I'm gonna, again, if you, our hymnal, Singing the Living Tradition, is also a theological document. Hymns are pieces of our theology. And I think, did you have a reading picked out? Or because I got one. Did you have one picked out, Emily?
I'm guessing we're having the same one. I had 704.
704 is a good one. Do you want to do 704? I was going to go with Francis David with 566.
Do it. Do Francis David.
Okay. But this is, so, I mean, if you take some of these names and some of these characters that we have talked about and look in the index of our hymnal, you'll see some more easily digestible adaptations of some of their most important concepts. For example, the one that we often use for religious education Sunday is, chanting, the Sunday sermon. Onward, upward springs, onward springs, whatever. But I'm going to finish with 566, which is the words of Francis David. God is one. In this world, there have always been many opinions about faith and salvation. You need not think alike to love alike. There must be knowledge in faith also. Sanctified reason is the lantern of faith. Religious reform can never be all at once, but gradually, step by step. If they offer something better, I will gladly learn. The most important spiritual function is conscience, the source of all spiritual joy and happiness. Conscience will not be quieted by anything less than truth and justice. We must accept God's truth in this lifetime. Salvation must be accomplished here on earth. God is individual. God is one. So there ends our reading and our time together. Thank you all for this really wonderful, deep, rich conversation.
Thank you so much.
We will see you next time.
Thank you both.